fallen leaves from way on high come to earth.
Jeff and I were driving east towards Susanville on Highway 89. This is Susanville, California. And we saw the sign for Hat Creek, and we remembered that Paul Allen had purchased some land out here and built an observatory. And there is a sign, Hat Creek Radio Observatory, 1.8 miles on the corner of Doty and Bidwell. And I saw this little sign here, launch 5, whatever that means.
Oh, Vanessa, it's off to the Allen Array. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to actually get into the grounds, whether they have a visitor center, whether there's a locked gate. There may not even be that many in the way of personnel who actually are at the site, since it can all be remotely operated over the internet. The interesting thing is that the Allen Array, as folks may or may not know, is a big ear on Earth using multiple radio telescopes to detect the faintest of signals that encode intelligence from well beyond the Earth, certainly probably well beyond our solar system, and probably looking at stars that are up to about 1,000 light years away, which means the signals that will have been emitted by these worlds will take 1,000 years to get to the Earth. Presumably, those signals would have to be necessarily broadcast, because the closest star system that you could actually pick up a radio or television broadcast from a major station to Earth using a radio telescope is Alpha Centauri, which is 4 light years away. So basically, if they're going to pick up any signals, the worlds from which those signals emanate would have to be actually literally reaching out to other worlds such as our own, where intelligent life that has the capacity for an advanced radio technology is extant. So it's a big mountain to climb as far as detecting these signals, but they're doing it anyway. Now, there have been calculations made based on certain parameters to determine whether or not there is intelligent, advanced technological life out in our own galaxy beyond the Earth. It's a famous series of equations that had parameters such as Earth-like planets that are in what are called the Goldilocks zone of their suns, so water exists primarily in a liquid state, and assumes things like the seeding of these planets with biological organisms of the single cell variety, and goes on to calculate the odds that such simple single cell organisms would go on to develop tissue, which is basically groups of organisms, colonies of organisms, that these tissues of organisms would go on to formulate advanced organ systems, that these organ systems that are found in just even some simple things such as insects would then evolve to the point where there would be a central nervous system. The central nervous system would then develop the capacity for complex organism control, eventually leading to the point where emotions and primitive intellect would develop, so that cause and effect could be correlated, and that later cause and effect correlations would lead to a much more advanced form of conceptual thought. And not only that, conceptual thought that's capable, has that organic capability through the use of hands, with fingers. Think about dolphins, for instance. They're probably nearly as intellectually as advanced as we are based on brain to body weight ratios. And the fact is, they don't have hands, so they could never develop an advanced technology. So there's all these factors that play into the fact that at some point, some organic form develops the capacity for a technology that is capable of broadcasting powerful broad beams or less powerful narrow beams of information, which would indicate that there is life somewhere in our galaxy that we could not otherwise come in contact with. Now, some would say that we've already had contact with advanced technological civilizations. There's a series on television by I believe it's the History Channel, called Ancient Aliens, who basically say that creatures from other worlds have traveled to the Earth and that they were deeply involved in the evolution of our technological states. When possible, in the past.
Make a legal U-turn.
Oh, we have a visitor center here.
Open year round, it says.
Wow, so that means we're in a year, it's round, and it should be open. Now, whether we're here at the right time is another question entirely. But anyway, we get back to the fact that there are those who believe either in historical past of humanity or in advance or in the present of humanity, we are already being contacted in some way or another by alien species who have literally traveled to Earth. That's another question entirely, and is outside the purview of the radio telescope, the Allen Array Observatory. As we continue to roll slowly along this actually a nice little well-maintained tarred road towards the visitor center, we will set aside the question of whether or not the Earth has been visited by advanced intelligences using spacefaring craft to get to Earth. Now, the question then becomes, are we in the position now with our current technology, and are there intelligences out there with a similar technology who are reaching out to Earth by way of radio transmissions? And that is the question that is being probed by the Hat Creek Allen Array of Radio Telescopy, that's got its big ear turned towards various parts of our own galaxy, is systematically going through a number of star systems that could exist within 1,000, let's say 1,000 light years of Earth, that is broadcasting signals. These signals have to be teased out of the background radiation because our galaxy is hot with all forms of radio transmissions, all kinds of spectral, everywhere from the infrared, microwave, all the way up to X-rays and cosmic rays. All of those are signals. And as we roll into the administrative center, we can see many of the radio telescopes. And many of them are currently listening in what I would assume is the common vector of direction.
Look at the little green footprints.
As you can see, they have this marquee set up. This is technically known as the Hat Creek Radio Observatory, and the telescopes themselves are the Allen Telescope Array. So I would suspect that Paul Allen funded the project of the actual radio telescopes, and I'm not sure who would have gotten the funds together to purchase the land and do the installations.
Not sure what that is. Looks like a runway here I'm standing on.
What we have here is a nice brief history of the projects that associate with that associate with our expanding understanding of the nature of the universe. We began with prehistory at a time where it was believed the universe was basically static. There was no change going on. Everything was settled. The stars were the only foundation of any kind of stability in the universe, and that the Earth was the center of everything that could be seen around us. There's a discussion here about 2137 BC, 4,000 years ago, which basically says at that time the Chinese recorded the very first eclipse, total eclipse of the sun. And because of that eclipse, it became well established that maybe everything wasn't settled. But what isn't mentioned here is that they had known about the planets for quite a while, and the fact that, and comets and other kinds of planetary solar system bodies, which indicated that the universe wasn't as stable as might have been once thought. So this would have gone on into prehistory. There's ancient information about astrological signs, the zodiac, so there was some indication of dynamicity in terms of the movements of the heavens.
You can hear the hum.
By the time we get to 1500 AD, there have been a lot of extensive observations of the planets using just eyesight, line of sight, primitive equipment that was used to just basically measure the positions of the planets. And we had already well established that the various planets could be in certain locations and had certain periods about them and could be predicted to be where they would be in the future. So by 1500 BC, we were doing that. We were measuring stuff, and we knew where it was, we knew where it was going, and we knew how to predict things like eclipses. At that time, of course, there was a relative dearth of knowledge of comets in the solar system, but there were a number of them that were known to return on a regular basis, such as Halley's Comet. By 1600, we had begun really systematically observing with telescopy, optical telescopy, the various planets of the solar system, which meant that Galileo had put together the first combinations of primitive lenses to be able to view craters on the moon and notice that there were small bodies orbiting around the planet Jupiter, and also the fact that Venus and Mercury went through phases, which was very important to basically dethrone the Earth from being the center of the universe, and suddenly now our sun was becoming the central body around which all things turned.
Well, I will begin with saying thank you, Paul Allen. Good use of his money, that investments.
By 1700, we now begin to understand that our sun was not the center of the universe and that it was part of a much greater system called the Milky Way galaxy. But they didn't know it was a galaxy at that time. They thought the Milky Way was the sum total of everything that existed in the universe. So we were, as telescopy improved, optical telescopy improved, we were beginning to suddenly observe things like globular clusters and nebulae, and we were beginning to see that stars were concentrated in certain patches and that there were areas that were relatively void of stars. So we were getting a sense of the structure of our own galaxy. It wouldn't be until later that we had telescopes large enough to envision the fact that our galaxy itself was what is considered an island universe, and that there were other island universes out there. And the way we can think of these is like there were vast deserts where there were very few stars between these galaxies, and these galaxies were concentrations of stars that were their own whirling vortices of motion of stars. And so by that time, by the 1800s, this idea was coming about that the Milky Way was not the only galaxy in the universe. By the end of the 1800s, Nikola Tesla had arrived on the scene and was beginning experimentation with radio waves. And he suggested that we could not only look at our galaxies and our universe through the use of optical instruments, in other words, through visible light, but that we would actually begin to look at the universe and look at our own galaxy using radio waves. The difficulty of radio waves has to do with wavelength. Basically, with radio waves, you have to have an enormous telescope to concentrate the waves in order to see and be sure that you're looking at just a very small part of the space. Whereas with telescopes, you can see a star, it looks like a point of light, and it's very precise as to its location, and you can get a lot of information from a very small region of space. But radio telescopy meant that you would not know exactly what you were looking at. You could, for instance, stick your hand up in the sky like this, and you could have a radio telescope turned towards it, a single small dish, and you would know whether the signal was coming from my index joint here or from my little finger joint there. But with a telescope, as you know, even with your naked eye, you can see a star as a tiny pinprick of light. So radio telescopy brought its own set of problems that have to do with the question of resolution.
And Nikola Tesla suggested that the radio technology could be used to contact or detect alien life.
That Carl Jansky discovers radio waves coming from the Milky Way. So basically, he was testing out some radio detection equipment, and I don't necessarily think it was being used for astronomy at that time. And as he swung it around, he noticed that the intensity of radio signals was stronger in the direction of our galaxy than it was when you started turning it away from the center of our galaxy. So, as I said, the whole problem of radio telescopy is resolution. We go on and on with radios as we get larger and larger radio telescopes, leading to the largest one, which is an Arecibo in Puerto Rico. Now you have a telescope that's as broad as a football field, and its resolution is now probably down to the tip of my little finger when it looks off into space. So now they're being able to divide space up into smaller and smaller regions and then map it in terms of radio signals that are coming out. It became pretty clear that Arecibo was limited in its capacity to detect radio signals and determine where they came from. But what if we look over here, set up a whole bunch of smaller radio telescopes over a vast area like this, and then you all had them turned on the same spot in space. Instead of having a single radio telescope that's limited in size, you would have radio telescopes that were now resolving almost to the point of seeing particular stars. And now you can actually begin to sample individual solar systems for signals, so that if you got a signal that looked like it embodied intelligent information and data in it, you would know precisely which star was in alignment with that signal. And you could begin to say, this signal corresponds to this star. And that's when you really begin to have the capacity to resolve an individual civilization in space as having the ability to broadcast a signal that can be detected on Earth. Now, to support all those radio telescopes, to manage their orientation and to capture their signals, you have to have a vast array of electronics. And of course, most of that electronics now is all digital. So these are all going to be some form of computer-based system. Servers with microprocessors that can not only decode any signal coming from space and record it, decode it, and store it so that it can be analyzed later on. Back in the 1990s, SETI, the organization that pretty much runs this radio telescope array, was actually sending out all this massive data to people with private laptop computers that were then looking at the signals to see if they could sift out intelligent information from among the vast amount of otherwise noise that radiates out from the various parts of the galaxy. And that's how SETI was hoping to discover a signal that with encoded intelligence and associate it with a specific stellar system.
Well, here's the construction of the center. So up, and that's what is inside that big building that I saw.
Well, heading out now. One of the intriguing things about the Allen array. It's basically in a scrub, almost a desert. And I recall seeing an image on the internet which purported to be an area that was like a field with grasses in it that was right off the boundary of the array. It's purportedly said that at one point they had broadcasted into space how we receive signals from space here at the Allen Array at Hatts Creek, and that there had been a return signal that was basically a crop circle of sorts that digitized information about how aliens supposedly create crop circles on Earth. I'll tell you folks, this sounds really specious, and it quite rightly should have been doubted from the beginning, because none of this terrain around here looks like it really supports grasses, unless we happen to notice off here to the south a vast field of coarse grasses. And of course you'd need a field of coarse grasses if you wanted to actually create something like a crop circle. So I'm just taking a little bit of a walk down here to see if there is any kind of field where such an event may have transpired. Looking at this radio telescope, I would best guess it is looking at the zenith. Could be looking towards a geosynchronous satellite in orbit, but it's basically a paneled array. It's not a single parabolic, so it's a paneled parabolic. It's clearly designed to reflect radio signals from above itself into that parabolic condenser above, and then finally into the receptor, where the signal is then turned into pure electrical signal and then transmitted to wherever it's intended to go. Another little mystery.
While Jeff was off filming, I was outside at the right time when these dishes started rotating. So they were now rotated down.
Atmosphere, depths of blue, draw them here, plunging down into the air. Stepping stones draw ever